All right. Well, it's a real pleasure to have Dr. John Newstead on the show today. Welcome.
Thank you.
This has been so much fun getting to know you and having you on. We had a great episode actually with you and Dr. Doug Lucas, and we took a deep dive into bones and bone health. And you just blew my mind. I'm so proud of that episode. I share that all the time. And I'm loving the work that you do. And I'm finding golden nuggets with you that I haven't found anywhere else, which is why I really wanted you to come on again today. And I want to continue that conversation around the bone scan and scores and the fear that comes with a bad score. And you explained that in the last episode, so I'll have a link in the show notes if anybody wants to go listen to that. You explained that the score isn't the whole story. And this is like the big takeaway I had from that episode. So maybe let's just briefly recap. What is a bone scan score, DEXA, and what's it measuring? And what does it completely miss about fracture risk?
First, I want to thank you for having me back on your podcast. It's always great. I enjoy speaking with you. I learn a lot from your questions and our conversations and your take on the research. It's always great. And also from Doug, Dr. Lucas, who you had us on together. He's brilliant, and I love his take and his interpretation of the research as well. And it's been fun for me. So thank you.
Oh, that's nice to hear.
The number on the test is unfortunately what is focused on almost exclusively during medical appointments. And it's unfortunate because it doesn't really tell the whole story. In fact, it tells less than half of the story. And what do I mean by that? Well, the most dangerous thing with bone loss is not a number on a test. It's if you break a bone. If you have osteoporosis in your woman and you fracture your hip, there's up to a 36% chance that you're going to be dead within a year. For men, also there's a high risk of mortality, and over half of the people who fractured never regain their pre-fracture level of pain-free life and mobility they had before. And nobody wants that. But the number on the test is really only as important and only as helpful as it can predict fractures. Unfortunately, what we've known since the 1990s is that a bone density test predicts less than half of people with osteoporosis who will fracture. A study came out after that, 2008, that quantified that a little better, that showed in that study that for women with osteoporosis, it only predicted 44% of them who will fracture and only 21% of men. And every medical organization that has looked at this research has correctly concluded that fracture risk depends on factors largely other than the bone density. And I discuss this in my book in the sense that, besides giving the data and all those citations to those studies in case somebody wants to dig in deeper to the research, that unfortunately, what happens is doctors primarily are treating a number on the test instead of the patient sitting in front of them. And that's tragic because when the bone density test number goes up, people think they're protected. And in many cases, they're not. In fact, the increase in bone density created by the FDA-approved osteoporosis medications is not an indicator that somebody's fracture risk is decreasing. In fact,
wait, let me reiterate this because this is pretty mind-blowing. Is that you said that in the DEXA score, which is this bone scan that you get when you're looking for your bone density to see if it's strong or not, you're frail, not frail, it's predicting less than half of the fractures. 44% it is mind-blowing because we do put so much weight into this, including myself. And I think this is one of the big mistakes we make is think, oh my goodness. So it's not a reliable way to predict fractures. And this is the other takeaway I had from that episode is it's not a score, a number we should be worried about. We should be worried about, are we going to have a fracture and then die early or have complications or have lower quality of life? So I just wanted to reiterate that how off the mark is some of these scans are. So sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah. No, not at all. Interrupt anytime. I love that. What you said, a couple things though that I think are super important to pull out. And one is you said bone strength, and you talked about fracture risk and the bone density test. And you mentioned frailty. Why is a bone density test not better at predicting fractures? Well, because it's really not actually measuring bone strength. It's measuring the quantity of bone, the amount of bone that's there, and technically the amount of minerals. It doesn't measure any other component of bone. And your bone is a tissue. It's a complex tissue like all tissues. It has different components to it. So there are the minerals, calcium, magnesium, other minerals. But then there's the non-mineral part of bone, the proteins in bone. There's 180 to 200 different proteins in bone. And the main structural protein in bone is collagen, bone collagen or type 1 collagen. That is what gives bone its ultimate strength, which in the research is termed quality. The bone quality is determined by the health of the bone collagen. The minerals will bind to the collagen. It gives the scaffolding to the bone for the minerals to be there. And it's flexible. Bone collagen, when it's healthy, can deform a little bit, allow the bone to bend and absorb the fall without being brittle. And additionally, it's strong. Strand for strand, collagen is stronger than steel. And so it's really important to understand, to get a bigger picture of bone, the bone mineral density test is just measuring one piece of bone health. And it's not the universal number that will give you an accurate predictor of your fracture risk, beyond the fact that, it will predict less than half of your risk. Now, what's the other half of the risk, or even a bigger piece of this puzzle? The bigger piece of the puzzle, and you touched on it, is frailty. Frailty is a measure of somebody's risk for falls. Frailty has to do with muscle mass and balance and stability. And what we know is that 95% of fractures occur because somebody falls. And in fact, this study I found was fascinating. I discovered this when I was working on the second edition of my book. Researchers, and not a new study, 20 years ago, looked at the combination of bone density from a bone density test and somebody's risk for falling, their stability on their feet. What is their risk for? Are they swaying back and forth? And can they trip without falling? And what's their stability? What they found is that when somebody was stable on their feet, a bone density test only predicted 5% of the people who would fracture.
Oh my
So
goodness.
in the research, the most consistent predictor of osteoporotic fractures is not a bone density test or the most sensitive indicator. It is gait and mobility, somebody's risk for falling.
Okay, this is so important. And I have to stop you here because I want this to sink in a little bit for some of the people, because you distinguished between bone strength and quality and quantity, right? So just because we may have a quantity of certain minerals, it only gives us part of the picture. In fact, like you said, there's collagen, there's so many other parts to the bone architecture that I think is really neglected. And if 95% of fractures come from falls, well, then the game is don't fall. Just what can we do to not fall? And that's when you said, let's look at gait and mobility. I would add agility as well. Like if you're about to fall, you can catch yourself. These are really important things to know. And I hope that I'd love to know then, okay, if this is going to be one of the ways to assess if we're going to have a fracture or predict a fracture, what do you mean by gait and mobility?
Great question. And I do want to say that you're right. A lot of this game is about strength and stability, but it's not solely about that. Doing things that will strengthen your bones, that will promote healthy bone collagen production, that will promote healthy muscle mass, will help promote and support healthy bone architecture, is not all about exercise and balance. It is about also creating the right metabolic and microenvironment within the bones that's going to allow the bones to also improve their bone density, because that is an important piece of this puzzle, but also maintain their strength. And so when I say gait is essentially how somebody is walking. In my clinical practice, when I was in clinical practice, I would meet patients in the waiting room. I didn't want them to be in the exam room already sitting on the table when I walked in, because the moment my eyes laid on them, the moment I saw them, that's when my examination began. So I would observe how strong was their handshake. Were they able to stand up from a seated position out of the chair easily, or did they have to lean forward in a way that makes me think that they might be a little deconditioned and push up using their arms to stand up? With their gait, are they shuffling? Are their feet shoulder width apart or wider? Are they favoring one side over the other as they walk? Are they high stepping? All of these things are clues to somebody's stability on their feet and their risk for falling.
You can see that even just on the street with some older adults who may, or even somebody who's injured for that matter. It's if you try to get up a stair and you really have trouble getting up that stair, and the same thing with chairs, you can observe this in our environment. So now I'm looking at people differently too. And as someone who has lived through hip osteoarthritis and was shuffling and was leaning to the side and was limping, and I can spot it a mile away on someone else now because it's just became so ingrained. And that's, again, thank goodness we have modern medicine, because I have a second life. If I didn't have the option to get a surgery, then I would probably have an early death because of these the things, all the things that come with this. And that's where we can see how, just one example, where having a gait, a certain gait or rhythm, can predict mortality or can predict the risk of a fall and a fracture. So I think that's really, really clear. And I also wanted to mention that when you describe the bone, and I think this is another important point, bone is mobile, and bone is always changing. It breaks down and builds up, and we hope to have that at the same rate, more or less, and we lose that as we're going through menopause. But we don't want it to just be strong like a piece of steel or brittle. And because if you fall, you can imagine, or a glass, it would just shatter. But if you have it with a bit of bend, and that gives the rebound, I guess, that you're looking for. And it reminds me a lot of bamboo. And bamboo is a bit like that. And even in Hong Kong, where I used to live, the skyscrapers are still built with bamboo scaffolding for the workers to go up. I'm thinking, I thought we use steel, but they're still using bamboo, probably for some of that strength. And that's, I think, what we are trying to say is strength also has some flexibility to it. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to address that a little bit more, but before I do, I left one important thing out of gait. I mentioned high stepping. What I see even more commonly is shuffling. People shuffling. And this was a challenge with my mother-in-law, who had osteoporosis, which is how I got involved in this field to begin with 20 years ago, because she was on Fosamax and her bone density was going up, but she shuffled. And when she walked, and she caught her foot on a throw rug in her house and fell and fractured her hip. And that's what got me really looking at the research, because her doctor was convinced she was protected, and so did I. I was convinced because her bone density had gone up, and so was she, but she wasn't. And that's when I started looking and discovering all of this research that I'm talking about and so passionate about educating people to and what they can do about it. But it's that shuffling, it's that home environment that is one of the most dangerous places for people, where most of the falls will occur. And so fracture proofing your home to prevent falls is really, really important. So getting rid of throw rugs, for example, and making sure that walking areas in your house don't have a coffee table jutting out into it that you can knock your leg on and trip and fall. And if pathways to the bathroom at night are well lit or clear of any clutter, those just practical advice and practical things people can do should not be underestimated and are rarely discussed in clinical appointments.
They're not at all. Not at all. And actually, you just cited my course on fall prevention in gerontology.
Oh,
it was exactly what we learned, which was really important. And I'd add pets to that too, because I say that pets are also, you could trip over your pets, not to get rid of them, but you got to be aware of them, I guess. But all of these things are super important. And you're right. No one tells you about this if you get diagnosis of osteopenia or osteoporosis. And yeah, I'm shocked, and it's really sad. So thank goodness you're here sharing this information.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And I apologize, but I did forget the question that you had asked.
Oh, I did too. I think we just went on different tangents. But actually, so I was really wanting to lean into how can we know if we're going to fall and fracture? Right. That's like the big thing. And that's where we brought into the gait and the mobility and muscle as well. I think you brought into the piece that having more muscle mass also helps. So explain why is that important?
Well, muscle can help with strength and stability. So catch yourself easier when you fall, prevent yourself from falling in the first place. But we talked about bone density tests, which is an X-ray. It's a radiology department kind of exam. It's a machine, but there are functional tests that people can do to understand, are they at risk for falling at an elevated risk, and they can track their improvement also. And I love these, and because they don't require you going into a doctor's office. And so there's a one-legged stand test. If you can stand on one leg for 10 seconds and then switch legs, you can do it on both legs even better. Your risk of dying is lower compared to somebody who can't do that as they age. There was a study that looked at people 51 to 55 years old, and at that age, over 95% of them could stand on one leg for 10 seconds. And then they followed them, and by the time they were 71 to 70, I think it's 71 to 75, 71 to 77, something like that, less than half of them could do it. And those who could not do it had about an 80% increased risk of dying. And so that's just an easy way to do it. The other is it's a little more involved, but a sit to stand test where you're sitting in a chair and you see how long it takes you to stand up multiple times, 10 times, I believe it is. It's in my book. I don't remember the exact number of times people have to stand up, but it's available online as well. The other thing is grip strength. Grip strength is associated with bone health and osteoporosis. And if you have a stronger grip strength, it's linked to better bone density. And so if you're just having a harder time opening jars, you can buy expensive. There are $400 machines that can be used in doctors' offices. And I'm sure people could also probably buy online now and test. Or you can just monitor yourself. When you're walking up the stairs and you grab onto the handrail, do you feel like you're not gripping as tightly as you used to? Things like that give clues that are really important. Can you stand up from the floor from a seated position without using your hands? Can you stand up from a chair without using your hands? All of these are important functional clues.
These are so good. I'm going to make reels with these things so we can all test ourselves and test our parents too. Because if 95% of the people can stand on one foot for 10 seconds, people go, oh, a big deal. But get your parents to do it who are in their 80s. That's a different story, because you said like less than 50% can do it. And if you can't, then 80% increased risk of dying. And well, we're going to die, of course. It's one of these things. We will eventually, as the closer we age, obviously. But explain that a little bit, because it's like a risk factor for mortality. I think it's maybe, to put things in context, perhaps we die a little bit earlier than we're programmed to. Is that correct?
Correct. And in the study, they didn't look at the reasons why people died. They just looked at the risk of death and mortality. But what do we know about how the body works, the physiology, and what other research shows in terms of strength and stability and mortality? Well, when you lose muscle mass, muscle, we already mentioned, is important for strength and stability, but it's also important for blood sugar regulation. Decrease in muscle, a condition called sarcopenia, is associated with over 200% increased risk of dying. And that also increases your risk for poor blood sugar control and diabetes. It increases your risk for falling. And we already mentioned the risk with falling and fractures and death. And so it's multifactorial, and that's really how the body works. And it's unfortunate how conventionally that we're trained that we tend to look at one symptom and one treatment for one symptom instead of really understanding what healthy physiology is, what healthy musculoskeletal system looks like and how it functions, and what can we do to promote and restore health based on what we know is healthy. And there's a lot of research showing that this approach, this integrative, holistic approach, works.
Yeah, there's a lot we can do. I'm interested in that grip strength. And some people show that you hang on to a bar and see how long you can hang. And I think some people have said if you can hang on for 1 minute, I don't remember the percent of lower risk of mortality, but I think for some of us, it's in their 50s. Maybe the goal is to try to reach a minute or two. Do you have any data on that?
I haven't looked at that, but it's fascinating. I imagine it's been studied. It's not something I've looked at, but it makes sense. And I think that in terms of muscle mass too, thigh circumference is associated with longevity. Meaning if your circumference of your leg is decreasing, your pants are fitting looser, that sort of thing, that's another thing to look at, that you are on a downward trend.
Well, it depends on the starting point. If you're obese and have a very chunky leg and you've lost some weight, you probably have other benefits because you probably need to lose weight. But if you're already, say, normal body weight and then you're shrinking into sarcopenia, that's the problem. So
that's an excellent point. Yes, that's an excellent point.
It's so fascinating. I myself have been practicing my hanging from a bar as well, and it's not easy. Everything's getting tired, and I think there's an association. The longer you're able to hang, you're probably just fit in general, because I've been introduced to a grip strength tool. I'm like, this is amazing. I can improve my grip strength, but it doesn't quite work like that, where you just improve this part, your forearms, and then you're good. So anyways, let's move on, because I think there's just so much to unpack here. And I'm actually really interested in making some more of these reels of can you do these things, because we can't imagine ourselves in our 50s, let's say 40s, 50s, what we're going to be like in our 80s. And life will probably be very different then. And I always say that diseases don't start when you're 70. They don't start when you're 80, Alzheimer's or osteoporosis. They start decades ahead of time. And this is why I think menopause is such a great opportunity to change the trajectory of your future self. And we do things today, and don't feel bad if you cannot do certain things right now. That's okay. You're not doomed. You have decades still to catch up. And this is why we can do certain practices and certain exercises in order to change that trajectory. I would like to know then, if somebody wants to practice some of these things, because including myself, I'm showing myself jumping off of a box and how to strength train. And if you're already have osteoporosis and your doctor said you need to be careful, how in the world are they supposed to do that? And one of the things I'm thinking of doing a bit more, giving more information on, is just the balance and the mobility, like you said. And where else how does somebody start in terms of lowering that risk of falls and that fracture if they really are in a severe or just diagnosed with osteoporosis, assuming that, they have low bone density?
In general, and I get this question a lot, where do I start? And there are a couple answers I have to that. The first is, don't start by diving headfirst in turning your life totally upside down, because that tends not to be sustainable. This is, as you mentioned, this is a long-term effort. Consistency over time is what's key. And I think that the initial effort that somebody's putting in needs to be appropriate for their interest level, because that can grow over time. And first and foremost, it has to be safe. So there was one study that was done in the 1980s. It's the only one that's been done of its kind, where they looked at the type of exercise that people with osteoporosis, women specifically with postmenopausal osteoporosis, were doing. And they looked at 4 different movements. One was, they actually prescribed these. It was a prospective clinical trial. So one was flexion, like sit-ups. One was sitting in a chair and bending forward. The other was sitting in the chair and sort of bending backwards. And the third one was laying on the stomach and doing the Superman pose, kind of arching your back up a little bit. At the end of the study, what they found is that 89% of the women who were doing the flexion exercises, like a sit-up, had vertebral fractures. So not all exercise is safe exercise, and it needs to be modified appropriately to be safe. So I'm a big fan of making sure that you work with somebody who knows what they're doing and has worked with people with osteoporosis, understands how to modify it. And there's a lot of trainers out there who unfortunately don't. And this is also where self-education is important. There's my book. There's other people's work out there, excellent books on exercise for osteoporosis. I think they're wonderful resources for people to be on this journey and learn and do it safely. But in terms of the actual exercises, and what we know is even just walking 7,000 to 7,500 steps per day is associated with a 50 to 70% reduction in all-cause mortality. So if somebody just wants to walk, that's where they're starting, then great. I'm all for it. Because what the research also shows is that as people are doing healthy activities in one area of health, let's say it's exercise or diet, they start improving their diet. As time goes on and they're experiencing some successes, they tend to start doing healthy activities in other areas of their life as well. And so what I don't want to do is overwhelm everybody where it says your exercise program must look like X or must be Y, because that's just not what the research supports.
Yeah, and what most of these exercise programs, I mean osteoporosis programs for exercise, I'm imagining, because I don't know, I haven't dug deep into them, but anyone who's posting on certain, these are exercises to do for osteoporosis on YouTube, for example, they're chasing a number again. They want to increase bone mineral density. They'll cite all this research that shows that you can increase bone mineral density of the hip by whatever percent, which is important, like you said, but it's not the only factor. And so this is where I think this is hopefully will be enlightening for people is, yes, all the things that you do to increase the bone's mineral density is great, I think, for longevity and aging anyways, but we just can't forget about the falls and the mobility and the just keeping our balance as well is important. Like you said, walking. If you walk, you're practicing taking steps more often and hopefully with a good gait. And that's where maybe if you notice you don't have a good gait or you're shuffling or you have some of these things that Dr. John was explaining, then get into a physio who can maybe help correct that. Because why are these people shuffling? Why are they having poor gait? And I know for me, I was in pain. Like that was making me do that. But what do you think is in the bigger picture of somebody who is struggling and the people maybe you've seen?
There's not a one-size-fits-all answer. It really depends on the individual. I think that there are things to rule out if somebody's gait is an issue. One could be a diabetic peripheral neuropathy. Maybe they just they've lost sensation in their feet, so they're starting to step differently. Or maybe they're pronating or supinating. Maybe they are in pain. Maybe they have foot pain. Maybe they have had a past injury where they've been decompensated on one side of the body, where one side is weaker than the other, and that then could be potentially corrected with physical therapy or very targeted exercise program to correct that imbalance. Maybe it's coming from their back, their low back. Maybe their sacroiliac joints locked up, or they have some arthritis back there. There are lots of different reasons why. Maybe it's an osteoarthritis of the knee or of the ankle. I think that it just needs to have a good assessment to understand. And like anything, we've got to have the right. One of my mentors and clinical mentors when I was in medical school, and one of my rotations was Tom Dorman, a brilliant medical doctor. Unfortunately, he passed away. But he looked at me and he said one day, he said, the best treatments come from the best diagnosis. And that's really what this is all about. What are we diagnosing? What are we really trying to correct? I don't want to just correct a number on a test. I want to correct the underlying dysfunction and help people understand what they can do, because the testing, all testing is limited. It's important to get, because people oftentimes don't even know they have a problem until they get the test results, and it's one piece to track. But the gait and the mobility and correcting that is crucial to a holistic approach.
And to get it on board now before you even get there. So I always say, I don't understand why in the gyms, at least here in Europe, I don't see classes on mobility and agility. The closest you would have to balance is maybe a yoga class, but that may be intimidating for somebody who's just getting started to this. So I hope in the future we do have more of these classes, because there's one thing to get it from a book. And I think your book and there's other people who have great books with the images of the exercises and do this and do that. But people, at least my generation, like to look at videos. And I don't know if the older generation does as well, but I imagine they do. And it's easier to follow somebody on a video than actually reading a book. But even better, seeing somebody in person who can correct you and say, you're close, but you're going to fall, or whatever that is. But just to say that I hope we do have more of these mobility, agility type of balanced classes, because it's like something's happening between 50 and 75. If you were losing 50% more or less of that ability, there's a window of opportunity here we can use now and not wait until we really need it.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of important things that are happening between that 50 to 75 year age gap. One is that, first of all, people are too sedentary, even before that. So even prior to their 50s, most people are not getting the exercise or the intensity or frequency of exercise that's important to get to maintain not just muscle mass and bone density, but overall health, cardiovascular fitness, and other health parameters. But what we see between that age group is that these nutritional requirements that were appropriate when we are younger are insufficient as we age to maintain health. And protein is a great example of that. So the U.S. recommended daily allowance for protein is 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight per day. And as people get older, there's a phenomenon called anabolic resistance, meaning you need more of that protein to create muscle mass than you needed when you were younger. And a clinical trial gave volunteers that amount, the USRDA amount of protein, and followed them, and they found out that it wasn't even that long, I think it was maybe just 6 weeks, if I remember correctly, that their thigh circumference shrank. They were already losing muscle mass. And other research showed that when you give a higher amount than that to the people who are elderly, which by definition is 65 years and older, but I think definitely in our 50s is important, that you increase with resistance exercise, you can increase muscle mass. The oldest participant was 85 years old, so really at any age. And based on my interpretation and reading of the research, my recommendation is a minimum of 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day, or if you measure your weight in pounds, it'd be 0.6 grams per pound of body weight per day. So just take your body weight and multiply it by one of those numbers, and that gives you the minimum number of grams that somebody should be getting. And I typically recommend then that they get about 10% more. Because another study also just gave participants the USRDA amount of protein, and the bone density decreased. So they looked at bone density in that study. So you really do need more. As I mentioned before, there are 180 to 200 proteins in bone. When you're giving your body those raw materials to do its job, it's like a car that's maybe out of gas. Once you give it the gas, designed to just do what it's supposed to do. It functions, it runs. And that's the same with giving our bodies the nutrients it needs to do well. What also starts to happen in our 50s and above is time starts to catch up with us. And that is that these sins of our past in terms of unhealthy eating, sedentary lifestyle, medications that we may be taking that could potentially create nutritional deficiencies or side effects, some damage, free radical damage to cells, those things can accumulate. And so changing that trajectory requires changing diet, lifestyle, and importantly also sleep habits.
There's a lot to unpack. I mean, we want to build better bones and better muscles as well. And I'm glad you brought in the nutrition piece, because we need to feed the muscles, or we need to feed the bones. We need some raw materials. If you said there's 180 to 200 proteins, boy, that means, I'm not sure if that means actually different types of proteins. Maybe you can explain what you meant by
yes, different types of proteins.
Different types of proteins. So there's some proteins are there for different, I guess, different functions, and some maybe build bone and muscle better than others. Is that the way to look at it?
Well, proteins in our body are structural and they're functional. So functional meaning they could be hormones, and our bones do have hormones, or there are structural proteins in bone like collagen. And so there are just many different proteins in bone that are doing many different jobs. And our bones, by the way, are not just about structure and allowing us to walk and move and jump and hug our loved ones and do all the things we love to do. Bones also produce our red blood cells and our white blood cells and our platelets. So it is the key to longevity. As you said, it's not just about building better bones. You know, I had kind of an aha moment that I'd never really thought of this before, so thank you. Really what this is all about is about building a better life and focusing on bones to do that.
Exactly. The bones are quite foundational and that's what helps us move around. And I just appreciate it so much. And when we talk about bones, we're not only talking about the strength, the structure, but also the joints, which is like a whole other can of worms, because they do go hand in hand. And when you mentioned the anabolic resistance, as we get older, we need more protein. And not to mention, as we go through menopause, we have the menopause gut. Almost every woman who's in my community has spoken to me has a gut issue. And you're not absorbing the nutrients from the food that you eat, or supplements that you're taking. And that's something I think really needs to be corrected. Metabolic health in general, but also the gut, so that we can actually utilize the things that we're putting in there. So I just had to mention that. And another thing to mention as well, when we talked about muscle and building muscle, we often forget that it's not only muscle mass, but it's power and strength that's going to help us live a longer life, but also to catch our falls, to be able to lift things without injury, and to keep going. So everything is just so connected. So I'm glad you bring this all in together. And you mentioned as well the stress and the sleep and medications, all these things, hormones, hormone loss. These are all affecting how our bones are building and remodeling. And we need to kind of look at the whole picture, not just, I think we're all focused on bone mineral density, and let's do an exercise to build it up.
And that's an important piece of the puzzle, absolutely. But it should, this holistic approach and looking at other factors that the research show are important in terms of minimizing fracture risk. Those are also really important to look at. And you mentioned medications, because I brought it up a little bit. And that's an important thing, because ultimately what's happening with bone loss and osteoporosis is that it's a disease of imbalance where the destructive forces are winning. So I like to look, as I'm conceptualizing this and talking to people, at two sides of this issue. One is, are there things in your life that are destroying your bones? Can we minimize or get rid of those? And then what can we do then to build bones back up, to maintain bone strength, to improve bone density, to reduce fall and fracture risk? And on the side of the equation that is the bone destroying activities or environmental toxins, in that category of things that are destroying bone and increasing fracture risk are many medications. There's a long list of medications that decrease bone density, make bone more frail, weaker, and also increase somebody's risk for falling, or perhaps all three at the same time. And this is a real blind spot in conventional medicine. Most doctors who are well-intentioned, well-meaning, they're prescribing medications that they truly believe, I think, are going to help their patients. What they don't know is this bone-destroying side effect of the medications. And that's why, again, education, learning, getting a medication review from a pharmacist, from your doctor, is really important, because serotonin reuptake inhibitors, like Prozac, Lexapro, anything that artificially increases serotonin, destroys bone. For every 19 women taking an SSRI now for 1 to 5 years, we'll expect 1 to fracture. There are serotonin receptors on bone. And the bone-destroying osteoclast cells, when serotonin is artificially elevated, it increases their activity. So they're destroying bone faster. And so we want to look at that. Can you get on a safer medication or somehow decrease that medication or get off of it altogether? Acid blocking medications also damaging bones. Medications for blood pressure. While not directly damaging bones, what happens is many people are on these medications for decades, and what was a healthy, appropriate dose of the medication when they were younger may not be appropriate when they get older. They may be over-medicated because as we get older, what tends to happen is our body's ability to break down and metabolize and eliminate drugs from our system decreases. And so what was a safe dose before now can be too high of a dose, and yet many people will go for many years without getting a medication review. And when your blood pressure drops too low, that increases your risk for falls. Similarly, 95% of the elderly, in the United States at least, are on a medication that increases their risk for falling. So these sedative hypnotic medications that are used commonly for sleep, Belsomra, any Ambien, those types of medications increase the risk for falls as well. So you take these things in combination where you've got drugs that are destroying bone, drugs that are actually increasing somebody's risk of falling in a population that is already at the highest risk for bone loss, frail bones, frailty, and fractures, and you've got a deadly cocktail of variables coming together that need to be addressed.
So important. I'm so glad you went through all of these, and people are probably thinking, oh, well, I'm on these medications, or now I'm going to have to go and review. So please go and review your meds if you are concerned about your bones. And people aren't thinking about that enough. And I wanted to ask I have a question that I prepared, but I'm wondering if I should restructure it because I wanted to go through the risk factors for osteoporosis. But should we reframe it in saying the risk factors for falls, or maybe we can combine that question together?
Yeah. You know what? I look at both of those and the risk factors for fractures because they're all intertwined. They overlap, but they are different. So medications I mentioned is a risk factor, and that is something that is important. And that there's a long list. There's a whole chapter in my book just on medication-induced bone loss. But when I look at this and think about the risk for osteoporosis or bone loss and fall and fractures, there are two categories in which I put these risk factors. One are what are called intrinsic risk factors, non-modifiable risk factors, meaning you can't change them. So age, getting older, is one of the also most consistent predictors for osteoporosis and fractures. Your medical history, you can't change that either. Your family history, you can't change that either. And I want to comment on that in a moment because I think there's an interesting interpretation to that research. But what you can change is your diet, your lifestyle, your sleep, your supplementation that you're taking. There are many things that are in your control, your environment, to try and fracture-proof your home and your environment. There are many things that are actually in somebody's control that can improve bone density, maintain bone strength, and reduce the risk for falling. The family history piece had some interesting aha moments, I think, as I was going through the second edition of the book and doing the research again, and it really occurred to me, and I looked up the research on this, and indeed there is research supporting this. Family history is a predictor. If your mother had osteoporosis, for example, you are automatically at a higher risk category. But nobody could explain to me why, because genetics is not really a major risk factor. There's no osteoporosis gene that's been discovered. The reason seems to be, in my opinion, that we inherit from our parents our diet and our lifestyle. People whose parents are sedentary are more likely to be sedentary. People who grew up eating a very poor quality diet are more likely to carry that into their adulthood. And so those are the things that I think people can address and people can change. And there's more in people's control than, at least in my conversations with patients, than they've ever been told about by their doctors or they've realized.
Okay, this is really interesting. I like the non-modifiable risk factors. Age is the biggest risk factor for all diseases of aging, unfortunately. The medical history, yeah, that could make sense. And especially if you're on, the medications, yeah, can modify maybe if you want to through diet and lifestyle, or maybe other types of meds to that doesn't increase your risk for falls or does not eat away at your bone. But one thing I would add, I don't know, and I'd ask you if that's also a risk factor, is being born with a small frame. Like you don't have that much bone to get in the first place. Is that
Being short stature or being underweight, I believe it's about less than 120 pounds, 117 pounds, it is a risk factor that is in the research, yeah.
Yeah, there's not much you can do about being born small frame, but if you're underweight, gaining a little bit weight, maybe you need it anyways, is important. But let's go through some of the things that actually are modifiable. And you mentioned the diet, lifestyle, sleep, supplements, and environment, but what are the things doing that people are not aware of that are actually increasing their risk of osteoporosis and the fractures in terms of their diet and lifestyle?
That's a great question, and it could potentially be a very long answer. So I'm going to try and do my best to summarize as briefly as I can. So,
otherwise, you read the book. It's in the book.
It is.
I'll have a link to that in the show notes.
Thank you. One of the biggest things with diet that has occurred over the last 30, 40 years is the introduction of ultra-processed foods. So these really, I think calling them foods is a gross distortion of reality and what they are. They're really environmental toxins. Ultra-processed foods are packaged foods. They are convenience foods that you can stick in your pocket or heat up in a microwave. They tend to have long shelf lives, and they tend also to have added chemicals. And ultra-processed food essentially takes the original food, whatever it might be, the plant, and it deconstructs it and breaks it apart into its component products of carbohydrates, fat, protein, fiber, modifies them, puts them together in unique ways, oftentimes with added chemicals in there that allow them to go through the machinery easier or increase their shelf life and stability, and packages them. And there are, in the U.S., 10,000 chemicals that are approved for the U.S. food system. In Europe, it's better. There's about 22,000 chemicals, so fewer. And now in the United States, 60% of calories in the U.S. diet approximately is from ultra-processed foods, and 70% of packaged foods on the shelves of supermarkets are ultra-processed foods. And across the board, the research has shown that the more somebody consumes these, the greater the risk for all chronic diseases, and even in children for ADHD and the exposure to artificial colors, but in adults with osteoporosis, even osteoporosis and bone loss. And so it's unrealistic to have people completely eliminate these foods from their diet. Based on the research in my reading, I recommend people try to consume at least less than 10% of their calories from ultra-processed foods. And remember now, in the U.S., 60% of calories on average are from ultra-processed foods. So that's a big problem, because not only does it promote nutritional deficiencies, and this has been shown globally with different research studies in different countries, but it also destroys the gut microbiome and contributes to dysbiosis and chronic inflammation in the gut. And there's a very strong gut-bone connection now, where if there's chronic inflammation in the gut, it contributes directly and indirectly to osteoporosis and fracture risk. And so modifying that and eating more of a plant-forward, whole foods, Mediterranean dietary pattern is what the research supports, what I teach and advocate. And that means consuming at least 30 grams of total dietary fiber a day, and then your protein requirement based on your body weight. I just ask people to focus just on plants and protein. So the more you can eat a plant-forward diet with good, healthy sources of protein, the better off I think people are going to be. And this is shown in the research. The closer somebody adheres to a Mediterranean dietary pattern, the healthier the outcomes are across all domains of health. And it's with respect to bone health and osteoporosis, a Mediterranean diet is associated with a 20% reduction in osteoporosis and about 20% reduction in hip fracture risk, the most dangerous type of fractures as well.
Yeah, I would add, I've been ever since I interviewed Dr. William Lee, he's a researcher and is really into nutrition. And we all talk about the Mediterranean diet because the research shows. But he likes to call it the Mediterranean diet. It's also a wonderful diet to follow, which I think, because I used to live in Hong Kong, and sometimes I talk about the Mediterranean diet and they're like, oh, it's so expensive, we can't get access to it. And I'm like, actually, all the foods here are pretty powerful too. So I think we can combine both depending on where in the world you're living. So that's another thing to add on. I don't know if you still have more to add to that list, but I have two more.
No, please, I'd love to hear yours.
Well, I think smoking and alcohol do quite a bit of damage in terms of the bones and the bone health and health in general. And we still have, I'm still amazed when I see people buying cigarettes. I'm like, oh, we're still smoking? Like, I thought we were done with that a long time ago.
So cigarettes is one of those known modifiable risk factors, and the risk in the research is current smoking of any level. So if you quit smoking, that risk for osteoporosis declines over time. With alcohol, there tends to be a threshold, I think. I mean, saying don't drink any alcohol, any amount of alcohol is going to increase your risk for osteoporosis and fractures, even like 1 or 2 drinks a week. That's just not supported by the research.
Interesting. Okay. One other thing to add to the hormones. That's a whole episode. We can do that. But that's part of it is non-modifiable because we're going to lose them, but it is modifiable because we probably put them back, right?
Yes, and I think that's where the anabolic resistance is coming in, because as we get older, men and women both tend to have their sex hormones declining, so testosterone, estrogen. And in fact, women do need some testosterone as well, and men do need some estrogen. And so just saying that for women it's all about estrogen and progesterone is insufficient and incomplete. And for men, just to say it's about testosterone is also incomplete. And in fact, if those are the only hormones you're focusing on, I think you're missing many important hormones like thyroid hormone, oxytocin, melatonin, which is a nutrient in supplements, but it's also a hormone, and other hormones as well, looking at this sort of more complete picture. But I do believe, that people when they're 50 years old should get some baseline testing with their hormones. I think that they should women in particular at 50 should get a baseline bone density test and get hormone panels done. Men, when they hit 50, should get hormone panels done. And anyone 50 years or older who breaks a bone should get a bone density test.
Absolutely. Okay. I'm going to have to let you go. I have 50 billion more questions, but I'm going to wrap up here. But I do like to wrap up with a rapid fire. And I hope to have you on again that you will be able to explain in long form what you mean. But for now, we're going to try to keep them short. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm asking a question. Just keep it short and we'll move on. So what is the single most underrated nutrient for bone health?
MK4.
Calcium supplements alone
Are insufficient. Nope. And not everybody needs them.
Best bone building exercise.
Whatever you're going to do consistently over time that is weight bearing.
Biggest myth about osteoporosis you wish would just die.
That it's inevitable and it's a one-way street.
Bisphosphonates like Fosamax, is it a friend or a foe?
Depends on the clinical situation.
Walking, swimming, or biking, which is better for bone health?
Walking.
Vibration plates.
Mixed.
Weighted vests.
Okay, but still would like more research on them.
OsteoStrong, these are or biodensity type exercise plans.
I have some concerns about the safety and efficacy based on one clinical trial that was published.
Osteoporosis exercise apps.
I think whatever is going to help somebody focus and do consistent and safe exercise is great.
And the last one, what's worse, osteoporosis of the hips or the spine?
Hips.
All right. This has been very interesting. I want to dive deeper into your answers here. So I would love to have you on again. and I do want to go down the nutrition route too, and supplements and all these things, because you have such a great knowledge about it. If people want to know more about you, they can find you at nbihealth.com. And you've got a podcast as well. It's very good. Delivering Health Podcast. I'm going to have links to that in the show notes. And please, everyone who's listening, go and read this book, Fracture Proof Your Bones. You can get that also on the nbi.health.com website. And I'm going to have links to that in the show notes. So before I let you go, Dr. John, is there anything else that you'd like to share before we go?
I just want to share how I'm such a huge fan of yours, and your questions are great. You're a nice person. I just have wonderful conversations with you, and I learn from you every time we talk. So I look forward to it. I'll look forward to another session like this or conversation with you because I just have so much fun. So thank you.
Oh, love it. Hashtag gratitude. And thank you for everyone who's listened to the end of the podcast. Thank you for being here. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. Please send me your questions, or Dr. John, your questions about osteoporosis and bone health. I'll have links to everything in the show notes. And thank you so much for your time, Dr. John. And I can't wait to have you on again.
Thank you.